The Kansas-Nebraska Act by Brandon Michael, period 7. The Kansas-Nebraska Act is very important in the United States history. It created territories for Kansas and Nebraska and also made some documents to give freedom to certain people. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was a very bloody and interesting subject that made Kansas and Nebraska what it is now. One of the people to help out to create the Kansas-Nebraska Act was Franklin Pierce. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 created the territories of Kansas and Nebraska, opening new lands for settlement, and had the effect of repealing the Missouri Compromise of 1820. The act was designed by Democratic Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois. The initial purpose of the Kansas-Nebraska Act was to open up thousands of new farms and made a Midwestern transcontinental railroad. The result was that pro- and anti-slavery elements flooded into Kansas with the goal of voting slavery up or down, leading to Bleeding Kansas. A wave erupted across the North as anti-slavery elements cried betrayal. For Kansas had been officially closed to slavery since the Missouri Compromise of 1820, now repealed. Kansas and Nebraska Act happened for people to decide for themselves whether or not to allow slavery within their borders. The Kansas-Nebraska Act opened many in the North who considered the Missouri Compromise to be a long-standing binding agreement. In the pro-slavery South, it was strongly supported. Pro-slavery settlers carried the election but were charged with fraud by anti-slavery settlers, and the results were not accepted by them. President Franklin Pierce, in support of the pro-slavery settlers, sent in federal troops to stop the violence and disperse the anti-slavery legislature. Another election was called. Once again, pro-slavery supporters won, and once again they were charged with election fraud. As a result, Congress did not recognize the Constitution adopted by the pro-slavery settlers, and Kansas was not allowed to become a state. The pro-slavery supporters were accused of fraud 2 times in a row. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 may have been the single most significant event leading to the Civil War. By the early 1850s, settlers wanted to move into the area now known as Nebraska. However, until the area was organized as a territory, settlers would not move there because they could not legally hold a claim on the land. The southern states' representatives in Congress were in no hurry to permit a Nebraska territory, because the land lay north of where slavery had been outlawed by the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Stephen A. Douglas said he wanted to see Nebraska made into a territory and to win Southern support, proposed a Southern state inclined to support slavery. It was Kansas, underlying it all, was its desire to build a transcontinental railroad to go through Chicago. The Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed each territory to decide the issue of slavery on the basis of popularity. Kansas, with slavery, would violate the Missouri Compromise, which had kept the Union from falling apart for the last 34 years. The long-lasting compromise would have to be repealed. Opposition was intense, but ultimately the bill passed in the May of 1854. Territory north of this sacred line was now open to popular areas. The North was outraged. The North felt that if the Compromise of 1820 was ignored, the Compromise of 1850 could be ignored as well. Violations of the hated fugitive slave law increased. Trouble was indeed back with a vengeance. The Kansas-Nebraska Act undid the compromise that was made in the Missouri Compromise, which designated a line of latitude to be separation of free states and slave states. The Kansas-Nebraska Act reignited the disagreement between pro- and anti-slavery factions. Fighting and violent events would become so terrible that it was termed Bleeding Kansas. This prevented any harm. If this didn't happen, then there would still be some slave states alive right now.